Chapter 16 of The Turn of the Screw, by Henry James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. I had so perfectly expected that the return of my pupils would be marked by a demonstration that I was freshly upset at having to take into account that they were dumb about my absence. Instead of gaily denouncing and caressing me, they made no allusion to my having failed them, and I was left for the time, on perceiving that she too said nothing, to study Mrs. Grose's odd face. I did this to such purpose that I made sure they had in some way bribed her to silence, a silence that, however, I would engage to break down on the first private opportunity. This opportunity came before tea. I secured 5 minutes with her in the housekeeper's room, where, in the twilight, amid a smell of lately baked bread, but with the place all swept and garnished, I found her sitting in pained placidity before the fire. So I see her still, so I see her best, facing the flame from her straight chair in the dusky shining room, a large clean image of the put away, of drawers closed and locked, and rest without a remedy.
"Oh yes, they asked me to say nothing, and to please them, so long as they were there, of course I promised. But what had happened to you?"
"I only went with you for the walk," I said. "I had then to come back to meet a friend." She showed her surprise.
"A friend? You?"
"Oh yes, I have a couple," I laughed. "But did the children give you a reason?"
"For not alluding to your leaving us? Yes, they said you would like it better. Do you like it better?"
My face had made her rueful. "No, I like it worse." But after an instant I added, "Did they say why I should like it better?"
"No, Master Miles only said, we must do nothing but what she likes."
"I wish indeed he would. And what did Flora say?"
"Oh, Miss Flora was too sweet. She said, 'Oh, of course, of course,' and I said the same."
I thought a moment. "You were too sweet, too, I can hear you all. But none the less, between Miles and me, it's now all out."
"All out?"
My companion stared.
"But what, miss?"
"Everything. It doesn't matter, I've made up my mind. I came home, my dear," I went on, "for a talk with Miss Jussell." I had by this time formed the habit of having Mrs. Grose literally well in hand in advance of my sounding that note, so that even now, as she bravely blinked under the signal of my word, I could keep her comparatively firm.
"A talk? Do you mean she spoke?"
"It came to that. I found her on my return in the schoolroom."
"And what did she say?"
I can hear the good woman still, and the candour of her stupefaction. "That she suffers the torments." It was this, of a truth, that made her, as she filled out my picture, gape.
"Do you mean," she faltered, "of the lost?"
"Of the lost, of the damned. And that's why, to share them—" I faltered myself with the horror of it. But my companion, with less imagination, kept me up.
"To share them?"
"She wants Flora." Mrs. Grose might, as I gave it to her, fairly have fallen away from me, had I not been prepared. I still held her there, to show I was. "As I've told you, however, it doesn't matter."
"Because you've made up your mind? But to what?"
"To everything."
"And what do you call everything?"
"Why, sending for their uncle."
"Oh, miss, in pity, do!" my friend broke out.
"Ah, but I will, I will! I see it's the only way. What's out, as I told you, with Miles, is that if he thinks I'm afraid to, and has ideas of what he gains by that, he shall see he's mistaken. Yes, yes, his uncle shall have it here from me on the spot, and before the boy himself, if necessary, that if I'm to be reproached with having done nothing again about more school—"
"Yes, miss,"
my companion pressed me. "Well, there's that awful reason." There were now clearly so many of these for my poor colleague that she was excusable for being vague.
But, which?
Why, the letter from his old place.
You'll show it to the master?
I ought to have done so on the instant.
Oh, no,
said Mrs. Grose with decision. I'll put it before him, I went on inexorably, that I can't undertake to work the question on behalf of a child who has been expelled.
For we've never in the least known what, Mrs. Grose declared.
For wickedness. For what else, when he's so clever and beautiful and perfect? Is he stupid? Is he untidy? Is he infirm? Is he ill-natured? He's exquisite. So it can be only that, and that would open up the whole thing. After all, I said, it's their uncle's fault, if he left here such people.
He didn't really in the least know them. The fault's mine.
She had turned quite pale. Well, you shan't suffer, I answered.
The children shan't,
she emphatically returned. I was silent a while. We looked at each other. Then what am I to tell him?
You needn't tell him anything. I'll tell him.
I measured this. Do you mean you'll write? Remembering she couldn't, I caught myself up. How do you communicate?
I tell the bailiff. He writes.
And should you like him to write our story? My question had a sarcastic force that I had not fully intended, and it made her after a moment inconsequently break down. The tears were again in her eyes.
Ah, miss, you write.
Well, to-night, I at last answered, and on this we separated. End of chapter 16. Turn of the Screw by Henry James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. I went so far in the evening as to make a beginning. The weather had changed back, a great wind was abroad, and beneath the lamp in my room, with Flora at peace beside me, I sat for a long time before a blank sheet of paper, and listened to the lash of the rain and the batter of the gusts. Finally I went out, taking a candle. I crossed the passage and listened a moment at Miles's door. What, under my endless obsession, I had been impelled to listen for, was some betrayal of his not being at rest, and I presently caught one, but not in the form I had expected. His voice tinkled out, "I say, you there, come in!" It was a gaiety in the gloom. I went in with my light, and found him in bed very wide awake, but very much at his ease. "Well, what are you up to?" he asked, with a grace of sociability, in which it occurred to me that Mrs. Grose, had she been present, might have looked in vain for proof that anything was out. I stood over him with my candle. "How did you know I was there?" "Why, of course I heard you. Did you fancy you made no noise? You're like a troop of cavalry." He beautifully laughed. "Then you weren't asleep?" "Not much. I lie awake and think." I had put my candle designedly a short way off, and then, as he held out his friendly old hand to me, had sat down on the edge of his bed. "What is it," I asked, "that you think of?" "What in the world, my dear, but you?" "Ah, the pride I take in your appreciation doesn't insist on that. I had so far rather you slept." "Well, I think also, you know, of this queer business of ours." I marked the coolness of his firm little hand. "Of what queer business, Miles?" "Why, the way you bring me up, and all the rest." I fairly held my breath a minute, and even from my glimmering taper there was light enough to show how he smiled up at me from his pillow. "What do you mean by 'all the rest'?" "Oh, you know, you know!" I could say nothing for a minute, though I felt, as I held his hand and our eyes continued to meet, that my silence had all the air of admitting his charge, and that nothing in the whole world of reality was perhaps at that moment so fabulous as our actual relation. "Certainly you shall go back to school," I said, "if it be that that troubles you. But not to the old place. We must find another, a better. How could I know it did trouble you, this question, when you never told me so, never spoke of it at all?" His clear listening face, framed in its smooth whiteness, made him for the minute as appealing as some wistful patient in a children's hospital. And I would have given, as the resemblance came to me, all I possessed on earth really to be the nurse or the sister of charity who might have helped to cure him. Well, even as it was, I perhaps might help. "Do you know, you've never said a word to me about your school, I mean the old one, never mentioned it in any way?" He seemed to wonder, he smiled with the same loveliness. But he clearly gained time. He waited, he called for guidance. "Haven't I?" It wasn't for me to help him, it was for the thing I had met. Something in his tone and the expression of his face as I got this from him set my heart aching with such a pang as it had never yet known. So unutterably touching was it to see his little brain puzzled, and his little resources taxed to play, under the spell laid on him, a part of innocence and consistency. "No, never, from the hour you came back. You've never mentioned to me one of your masters, one of your comrades, nor the least little thing that ever happened to you at school. Never, little Miles. No, never, have you given me an inkling of anything that may have happened there. Therefore you can fancy how much I'm in the dark. Until you came out that way this morning, you had, since the first hour I saw you, scarce even made a reference to anything in your previous life. You seemed so perfectly to accept the present. It was extraordinary how my absolute conviction of his secret precocity, or whatever I might call the poison of an influence that I dared but half to phrase, made him, in spite of the faint breath of his inward trouble, appear as accessible as an older person, imposed him almost as an intellectual equal. "I thought you wanted to go on as you are." It struck me that at this he just faintly coloured. He gave, at any rate, like a convalescent slightly fatigued, a languid shake of his head. "I don't. I don't. I want to get away." "You're tired of Bly?" "Oh no, I like Bly." "Well then." "Oh, you know what a boy wants." I felt that I didn't know so well as Miles, and I took temporary refuge. "You want to go to your uncle?" Again at this, with his sweet ironic face, he made a movement on the pillow. "Ah, you can't get off with that." I was silent a little, and it was I now, I think, who changed colour. "My dear, I don't want to get off." "You can't, even if you do. You can't. You can't." He lay beautifully staring. "My uncle must come down, and you must completely settle things." "If we do," I returned with some spirit, "you may be sure it'll be to take you quite away." "Well, don't you understand that that's exactly what I'm working for? You'll have to tell him, about the way you've let it all drop. You'll have to tell him a tremendous lot." The exultation with which he uttered this helped me somehow for the instant to meet him rather more. "And how much will you, Miles, have to tell him? There are things he'll ask you." He turned it over. "Very likely, but what things?" "The things you've never told me, to make up his mind what to do with you. He can't send you back." "Oh, I don't want to go back," he broke in. "I want a new field." He said it with admirable serenity, with positive unimpeachable gaiety, and doubtless it was that very note that most evoked for me the poignancy, the unnatural childish tragedy, of his probable reappearance at the end of 3 months with all this bravado, and still more dishonour. It overwhelmed me now that I should never be able to bear that, and it made me let myself go. I threw myself upon him, and in the tenderness of my pity I embraced him. "Dear little Miles! Dear little Miles!" My face was close to his, and he let me kiss him, simply taking it with indulgent good humour. "Well, old lady?" "Is there nothing, nothing at all that you want to tell me?" He turned off a little, facing round toward the wall, and holding up his hand to look at as one had seen sick children look. "I've told you. I told you this morning." Oh, I was sorry for him. "That you just want me not to worry you?" He looked round at me now, as if in recognition of my understanding him. Then ever so gently, "To let me alone," he replied. There was even a singular little dignity in it, something that made me release him, yet, when I had slowly risen, linger beside him. God knows I never wished to harass him, but I felt that merely at this to turn my back on him was to abandon, or to put it more truly, to lose him. "I've just begun a letter to your uncle," I said. "Well, then, finish it." I waited a minute. "What happened before?" He gazed up at me again. "Before what?" "Before you came back, and before you went away." For some time he was silent, but he continued to meet my eyes. "What happened?" It made me, the sound of the words, in which it seemed to me that I caught for the very first time a small faint quaver of consenting consciousness, it made me drop on my knees beside the bed and seize once more the chance of possessing him. Dear little Miles, if you knew how I want to help you! It's only that, it's nothing but that, and I'd rather die than should give you a pain or do you a wrong. I'd rather die than hurt a hair of you. Dear little Miles! Oh, I brought it out now, even if I should go too far. I just want you to help me to save you." But I knew in a moment after this that I had gone too far. The answer to my appeal was instantaneous, but it came in the form of an extraordinary blast and chill, a gust of frozen air, and a shake of the room as great as if in the wild wind the casement had crashed in. The boy gave a loud, high shriek, which, lost in the rest of the shock of sound, might have seemed indistinctly, though I was so close to him, a note either of jubilation or of terror. I jumped to my feet again, and was conscious of darkness. So for a moment we remained, while I stared about me and saw that the drawn curtains were unstirred, and the window tight. "Why, the candle's out!" I then cried. "It was I who blew it, dear," said Miles. End of chapter 17. Turn of the Screw by Henry James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The next day, after lessons, Mrs. Grose found a moment to say to me quietly, "Have you written, miss?" "Yes, I've written." But I didn't add, for the hour, that my letter, sealed and directed, was still in my pocket. There would be time enough to send it before the messenger should go to the village. Meanwhile there had been, on the part of my pupils, no more brilliant, more exemplary morning. It was exactly as if they had both had at heart to gloss over any recent little friction. They performed the dizziest feats of arithmetic, soaring quite out of my feeble range, and perpetrated, in higher spirits than ever, geographical and historical jokes. It was conspicuous, of course, in Miles in particular, that he appeared to wish to show how easily he could let me down. This child, to my memory, really lives in a setting of beauty and misery that no words can translate. There was a distinction all his own in every impulse he revealed. Never was a small natural creature, to the uninitiated eye all frankness and freedom, a more ingenious, a more extraordinary little gentleman. I had perpetually to guard against the wonder of contemplation into which my initiated view betrayed me, to check the irrelevant gaze and discouraged sigh in which I constantly both attacked and renounced the enigma of what such a little gentleman could have done that deserved a penalty. Say that by the dark prodigy I knew, the imagination of all evil had been opened up to him. All the justice within me ached for the proof that it could ever have flowered into an act. He had never at any rate been such a little gentleman as when, after our early dinner on this dreadful day, he came round to me and asked if I shouldn't like him, for half an hour, to play to me. David playing to Saul could never have shown a finer sense of the occasion. It was literally a charming exhibition of tact, of magnanimity, and quite tantamount to his saying outright, "The true knights we love to read about never push an advantage too far. I know what you mean now. You mean that, to be let alone yourself and not followed up, you'll cease to worry and spy upon me, won't keep me so close to you, will let me go and come. Well, I come, you see, but I don't go. There'll be plenty of time for that. I do really delight in your society, and I only want to show you that I contended for a principle." It may be imagined whether I resisted this appeal, or failed to accompany him again, hand in hand, to the schoolroom. He sat down at the old piano, and played as he had never played, and if there are those who think he had better have been kicking a football, I can only say that I wholly agree with them. For at the end of a time that under his influence I had quite ceased to measure, I started up with a strange sense of having literally slept at my post. It was after luncheon, and by the schoolroom fire, and yet I hadn't really in the least sense slept. I had only done something much worse. I had forgotten. Where all this time was Flora? When I put the question to Miles, he played on a minute, before answering, and then could only say, "Why, my dear, how do I know?" breaking moreover into a happy laugh, which immediately after, as if it were a vocal accompaniment, he prolonged into incoherent, extravagant song. I went straight to my room, but his sister was not there. Then, before going downstairs, I looked into several others. As she was nowhere about, she would surely be with Mrs. Grose, whom, in the comfort of that theory, I accordingly proceeded in quest of. I found her where I had found her the evening before, but she met my quick challenge with blank, scared ignorance. She had only supposed that, after the repast, I had carried off both the children, as to which she was quite in her right, for it was the very first time I had allowed the little girl out of my sight without some special provision. Of course now indeed she might be with the maids, so that the immediate thing was to look for her without an air of alarm. This we promptly arranged between us; but when, 10 minutes later, and in pursuance of our arrangement, we met in the hall, it was only to report on either side that after guarded inquiries we had altogether failed to trace her. For a minute there, apart from observation, we exchanged mute alarms, and I could feel with what high interest my friend returned me all those I had from the first given her.
"She'll be above," she presently said, "in one of the rooms you haven't searched."
"No, she's at a distance." I had made up my mind. She has gone out. Mrs. Grose stared.
"Without a hat?"
I naturally also looked volumes. "Isn't that woman always without one?"
"She's with her?"
"She's with her," I declared. "We must find them." My hand was on my friend's arm, but she failed for the moment, confronted with such an account of the matter, to respond to my pressure. She communed, on the contrary, on the spot, with her uneasiness.
"And where's Master Miles?"
"Oh, he's with Quint, there in the schoolroom."
"Lord, miss!"
My view, I was myself aware, and therefore I suppose my tone, had never yet reached so calm an assurance. "The trick's played," I went on. "They've successfully worked their plan. He found the most divine little way to keep me quiet while she went off."
"Divine?"
Mrs. Grose bewilderedly echoed. "Infernal, then," I almost cheerfully rejoined. "He has provided for himself as well. But come." She had helplessly gloomed at the upper regions.
"You leave him?"
"So long with Quint? Yes, I don't mind that now." She always ended at these moments by getting possession of my hand, and in this manner she could at present still stay me. But after gasping an instant at my sudden resignation,
"Because of your letter?"
she eagerly brought out. I quickly, by way of answer, felt for my letter, drew it forth, held it up, and then, freeing myself, went and laid it on the great hall table. "Luke will take it," I said as I came back. I reached the house door and opened it. I was already on the steps. My companion still demurred. The storm of the night and the early morning had dropped, but the afternoon was damp and grey. I came down to the drive while she stood in the doorway.
"You go with nothing on?"
"What do I care when the child has nothing? I can't wait to dress," I cried, "and if you must do so, I leave you. Try meanwhile yourself upstairs."
"With them?"
Oh, on this the poor woman promptly joined me. End of chapter 18. The Turn of the Screw by Henry James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. We went straight to the lake, as it was called at Bly, and I dare say rightly called, though I reflect that it may in fact have been a sheet of water less remarkable than it appeared to my untravelled eyes. My acquaintance with sheets of water was small, and the pool of Bly, at all events on the few occasions of my consenting, under the protection of my pupils, to affront its surface in the old flat-bottomed boat moored there for our use, had impressed me both with its extent and its agitation. The usual place of embarkation was half a mile from the house, but I had an intimate conviction that, wherever Flora might be, she was not near home. She had not given me the slip for any small adventure, and since the day of the very great one that I had shared with her by the pond, I had been aware, in our walks, of the quarter to which she most inclined. This was why I had now given to Mrs. Grose's steps so marked a direction that made her, when she perceived it, oppose a resistance that showed me she was freshly mystified.
"You're going to the water, miss? You think she's in?"
She may be, though the depth is, I believe, nowhere very great; but what I judge most likely is that she's on the spot from which, the other day, we saw together what I told you.
"When she pretended not to see?"
With that astounding self-possession. I've been always sure she wanted to go back alone, and now her brother has managed it for her. Mrs. Grose still stood where she had stopped.
"You suppose they really talk of them?"
I could meet this with a confidence. They say things that, if we heard them, would simply appall us.
"And if she is there?"
"Yes."
"Then Miss Jessel is?"
"Beyond a doubt. You shall see."
"Oh, thank you!"
my friend cried, planted so firm that, taking it in, I went straight on without her. By the time I reached the pool, however, she was close behind me, and I knew that, whatever to her apprehension might befall me, the exposure of my society struck her as her least danger. She exhaled a moan of relief as we at last came in sight of the greater part of the water, without a sight of the child. There was no trace of Flora on that nearer side of the bank where my observation of her had been most startling, and none on the opposite edge, where, save for a margin of some 20 yards, a thick copse came down to the water. The pond, oblong in shape, had a width so scant compared to its length that, with its ends out of view, it might have been taken for a scant river. We looked at the empty expanse, and when I felt the suggestion of my friend's eyes, I knew what she meant, and I replied with a negative headshake. "No, no, wait, she has taken the boat." My companion stared at the vacant mooring-place, and then again across the lake.
"Then where is it?"
"Our not seeing it is the strongest of proofs. She has used it to go over, and then has managed to hide it."
"All alone? That child?"
"She's not alone, and at such times she's not a child. She's an old, old woman." I scanned all the visible shore, while Mrs. Grose took again into the queer element I offered her one of her plunges of submission. Then I pointed out that the boat might perfectly be in a small refuge formed by one of the recesses of the pool, an indentation masked for the hither side by a projection of the bank, and by a clump of trees growing close to the water.
"But if the boat's there, where on earth's she?"
my colleague anxiously asked. "That's exactly what we must learn," and I started to walk further.
"By going all the way round?"
"Certainly, far as it is. It'll take us but 10 minutes, but it's far enough to have made the child prefer not to walk. She went straight over."
"Laws!"
cried my friend again. The chain of my logic was ever too much for her. It dragged her at my heels even now, and when we had got half-way round, a devious, tiresome process, on ground much broken and by a path choked with overgrowth, I paused to give her breath. I sustained her with a grateful arm, assuring her that she might hugely help me, and this started us afresh, so that in the course of but a few minutes more we reached a point from which we found the boat to be where I had supposed it. It had been intentionally left as much as possible out of sight, and was tied to one of the stakes of a fence that came just there down to the brink, and that had been an assistance to disembarking. I recognised, as I looked at the pair of short thick oars, quite safely drawn up, the prodigious character of the feat for a little girl. But I had lived by this time too long among wonders, and had panted to too many livelier measures. There was a gate in the fence through which we passed, and that brought us, after a trifling interval, more into the open. Then, "There she is!" we both exclaimed at once. Flora, a short way off, stood before us on the grass, and smiled as if her performance was now complete. The next thing she did, however, was to stoop straight down and pluck, quite as if it were all she was there for, a big ugly spray of withered fern. I instantly became sure she had just come out of the copse. She waited for us, not herself taking a step, and I was conscious of the rare solemnity with which we presently approached her. She smiled and smiled, and we met, but it was all done in a silence by this time flagrantly ominous. Mrs. Grose was the first to break the spell. She threw herself on her knees, and drawing the child to her breast, clasped in a long embrace the little tender yielding body. While this dumb convulsion lasted I could only watch it, which I did the more intently when I saw Flora's face peep at me over her companion's shoulder. It was serious now, the flicker had left it, but it strengthened the pang with which I at that moment envied Mrs. Grose the simplicity of her relation. Still, all this while, nothing more passed between us, save that Flora had let her foolish fern again drop to the ground. What she and I had virtually said to each other was that pretexts were useless now. When Mrs. Grose finally got up, she kept the child's hand, so that the two were still before me, and the singular reticence of our communion was even more marked in the frank look she launched me. "I'll be hanged," it said, "if I'll speak." It was Flora, who, gazing all over me in candid wonder, was the first. She was struck with our bareheaded aspect. "Why, where are your things?" "Where yours are, my dear," I promptly returned. She had already got back her gaiety, and appeared to take this as an answer quite sufficient. "And where's Miles?" she went on. There was something in the small valour of it that quite finished me. These 3 words from her were in a flash like the glitter of a drawn blade, the jostle of the cup that my hand, for weeks and weeks, had held high and full to the brim, that now, even before speaking, I felt overflow in a deluge. "I'll tell you, if you'll tell me," I heard myself say, then heard the tremor in which it broke. "Well, what?" Mrs. Grose's suspense blazed at me, but it was too late even now, and I brought the thing out handsomely. "Where, my pet, is Miss Jessel?" Chapter 19. The Turn of the Screw, by Henry James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Just as in the churchyard with Miles, the whole thing was upon us. Much as I had made of the fact that this name had never once between us been sounded, the quick, smitten glare with which the child's face now received it fairly likened my breach of the silence to the smash of a pane of glass. It added to the interposing cry, as if to stay the blow, that Mrs. Grose at the same instant uttered over my violence, the shriek of a creature scared, or rather wounded, which in turn within a few seconds was completed by a gasp of my own. I seized my colleague's arm. "She's there! She's there!" Miss Jessel stood before us on the opposite bank, exactly as she had stood the other time, and I remember strangely, as the first feeling now produced in me, my thrill of joy at having brought on a proof. She was there, and I was justified. She was there, and I was neither cruel nor mad. She was there for poor scared Mrs. Grose, but she was there most for Flora, and no moment of my monstrous time was perhaps so extraordinary as that in which I consciously threw out to her, with the sense that, pale and ravenous demon as she was, she would catch and understand it, an inarticulate message of gratitude. She stood erect on the spot my friend and I had lately quitted, and there was not, in all the long reach of her desire, an inch of her evil that fell short. This first vividness of vision and emotion were things of a few seconds, during which Mrs. Grose's dazed blink across to where I pointed struck me as a sovereign sign that she too at last saw, just as it carried my own eyes precipitately to the child. The revelation, then, of the manner in which Flora was affected startled me, in truth, far more than it would have done to find her also merely agitated, for direct dismay was of course not what I had expected. Prepared and on her guard as our pursuit had actually made her, she would repress every betrayal, and I was therefore shaken on the spot by my first glimpse of the particular one for which I had not allowed. To see her, without a convulsion of her small pink face, not even feign to glance in the direction of the prodigy I announced, but only, instead of that, turn at me an expression of hard, still gravity, an expression absolutely new and unprecedented, and that appeared to read and accuse and judge me, this was a stroke that somehow converted the little girl herself into the very presence that could make me quail. I quailed even though my certitude that she thoroughly saw was never greater than that instant, and in the immediate need to defend myself I called it passionately to witness. "She's there, you unhappy little thing! There! 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 And you see her as well as you see me!" I had said shortly before to Mrs. Grose that she was not at these times a child, but an old, old woman, and that description of her could not have been more strikingly confirmed than in the way in which, for all answer to this, she simply showed me, without a concession, an admission of her eyes, a countenance of deeper and deeper, of indeed suddenly quite fixed reprobation. I was by this time, if I can put the whole thing at all together, more appalled at what I may properly call her manner than at anything else, though it was simultaneously with this that I became aware of having Mrs. Grose also, and very formidably, to reckon with. My elder companion, the next moment, at any rate, blotted out everything but her own flushed face, and her loud, shocked protest, a burst of high disapproval. "What a dreadful turn, to be sure, miss! Where on earth do you see anything?" I could only grasp her more quickly yet, for even while she spoke the hideous plain presence stood undimmed and undaunted. It had already lasted a minute, and it lasted while I continued, seizing my colleague, quite thrusting her at it and presenting her to it, to insist with my pointing hand. "You don't see her exactly as we see? You mean to say you don't now? Now? She's as big as a blazing fire. Only look, dearest woman, look!" She looked, even as I did, and gave me, with her deep groan of negation, repulsion, compassion, the mixture with her pity of her relief at her exemption, a sense touching to me even then that she would have backed me up if she could. I might well have needed that, for with this hard blow of the proof that her eyes were hopelessly sealed, I felt my own situation horribly crumble. I felt, I saw, my livid predecessor press from her position on my defeat, and I was conscious, more than all, of what I should have from this instant to deal with in the astounding little attitude of Flora. Into this attitude Mrs. Grose immediately and violently entered, breaking, even while there pierced through my sense of ruin a prodigious private triumph, into breathless reassurance. "She isn't there, little lady, and nobody's there, and you never see nothing, my sweet. How can poor Miss Jessel, when poor Miss Jessel's dead and buried? We know, don't we, love?" And she appealed, blundering into the child. "It's all a mere mistake, and a worry, and a joke, and we'll go home as fast as we can." Our companion, on this, had responded with a strange, quick primness of propriety, and they were again, with Mrs. Grose on her feet, united, as it were, in pained opposition to me. Flora continued to fix me with her small mask of reprobation, and even at that minute I prayed God to forgive me for seeming to see that, as she stood there holding tight to our friend's dress, her incomparable childish beauty had suddenly failed, had quite vanished. I've said it already. She was hideously hard. She had turned common and almost ugly.
"I don't know what you mean. I see nobody. I see nothing. I never have. I think you're cruel. I don't like you."
Then, after this deliverance, which might have been that of a vulgarly pert little girl in the street, she hugged Mrs. Grose more closely, and buried in her skirts the dreadful little face. In this position she produced an almost furious wail.
"Take me away! Take me away! Oh, take me away from her!"
"From me?" I panted.
"From you! From you!" she cried.
Even Mrs. Grose looked across at me dismayed, while I had nothing to do but communicate again with the figure that on the opposite bank, without a movement, as rigidly still as if catching beyond the interval our voices, was as vividly there for my disaster as it was not there for my service. The wretched child had spoken exactly as if she had got from some outside source each of her little stabbing words, and I could therefore, in the full despair of all I had to accept, but sadly shake my head at her. If I had ever doubted, all my doubt would at present have gone. I've been living with the miserable truth, and now it is only too much closed round me. Of course I've lost you. I've interfered, and you've seen, under her dictation, with which I faced over the pool again, our infernal witness, the easy and perfect way to meet it. I've done my best, but I've lost you. Good-bye." For Mrs. Grose I had an imperative, an almost frantic "Go! Go!" before which, in infinite distress, but mutely possessed of the little girl, and clearly convinced, in spite of her blindness, that something awful had occurred and some collapse engulfed us, she retreated, by the way we had come, as fast as she could move. Of what first happened when I was left alone, I had no subsequent memory. I only knew that at the end of, I suppose, a quarter of an hour, an odorous dampness and roughness, chilling and piercing my trouble, had made me understand that I must have thrown myself on my face on the ground, and given way to a wildness of grief. I must have lain there long and cried and sobbed, for when I raised my head the day was almost done. I got up and looked a moment through the twilight at the grey pool and its blank haunted edge, and then I took back to the house my dreary and difficult course. When I reached the gate in the fence, the boat, to my surprise, was gone, so that I had a fresh reflection to make on Flora's extraordinary command of the situation. She passed that night, by the most tacit, and, I should add, were not the word so grotesque a false note, the happiest of arrangements with Mrs. Grose. I saw neither of them on my return, but, on the other hand, as by an ambiguous compensation, I saw a great deal of Miles. I saw, I can use no other phrase, so much of him, that it was as if it were more than it had ever been. No evening I had passed at Bly had the portentous quality of this one, in spite of which, and in spite also of the deeper depths of consternation that had opened beneath my feet, there was literally, in the ebbing actual, an extraordinarily sweet sadness. On reaching the house I had never so much as looked for the boy. I had simply gone straight to my room to change what I was wearing, and to take in, at a glance, much material testimony to Flora's rupture. Her little belongings had all been removed. When later, by the schoolroom fire, I was served with tea by the usual maid, I indulged, on the article of my other pupil, in no inquiry whatever. He had his freedom now; he might have it to the end. Well, he did have it, and it consisted, in part at least, of his coming in at about 8 o'clock and sitting down with me in silence. On the removal of the tea-things I had blown out the candles and drawn my chair closer. I was conscious of a mortal coldness, and felt as if I should never again be warm. So, when he appeared, I was sitting in the glow with my thoughts. He paused a moment by the door as if to look at me, then, as if to share them, came to the other side of the hearth and sank into a chair. We sat there in absolute stillness, yet he wanted, I felt, to be with me. End of chapter 20.